There we go. All righty. Make sure. All right. Got this all set up. I don't know why it's not showing up right. But now you're looking at the big first slide, right?
The banana slug facts.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. So just wanted to make sure I was on the right slide, and that you were seeing the right screen.
Hmm.
Well, anyway, for those of you who've not already seen this, this is a redo of the Faith Forum from November 3rd on how I spent my summer vacations and what I learned. And that's not quite all of it, of course, but it seems to be a good way to begin. So the time was spread out over the course of the summer, and the main event was a long road trip. The first week, however, for which many people or which many people found interesting, was the bike ride that I did from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and the AIDS life cycle. And I did this because I had the time, and I remembered doing this ride in 2005. And as I said, it's a ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And I thought, well, let's see if I can still do this in 2024. And so I signed up, which was momentous in its own way. So um, the route took me, like I say, from San Francisco down the Highway 1 along the California coast to basically to Santa Cruz. And then about Watsonville, we turned inland, or we followed the route inland and went on Highway 101 through the Salinas Valley, um, down into the southern Salinas Valley. And then we went back over the Coast Range to Highway 101, or to Highway 1, and then mostly followed Highway 1, a little bit of a blip back into 101 down there in the lower left-hand corner. And then back to Highway 1, um, all the way from basically Morro Bay into Santa Monica. And again, it was 540 miles. It was a good long bike ride. The elevation charts on the right are somewhat deceptive because they've compressed or expanded a distance into what filled the screen. And so the second day was 106 miles, and the fifth day was only 46 miles, but they both fill the screen. So it's hard to uh, talk about how the elevation worked when you're just looking at those charts. But basically, days number 3 and number 5 were the most challenging days in terms of hills. Um, Day number 1 looks like it was really hilly, and there was some hills, but it was mostly along the California coast, and so the y-axis is a little bit deceptive. So anyway, it was you'll see it at the in a few minutes what the total elevation was. It was a challenging ride, but it was and it was the last. I thought it was going to be the last time I was going to be able to do this at my age, and there are a number of reasons why it ended up being, yes, indeed, the last time I was going to be able to do this. Um, so, but there was a lot of good stuff about it. Um, we had about 1,400 riders and maybe 500 roadies, and all together we raised close to $11 million to help AIDS relief, AIDS education, HIV AIDS relief, education, and all of that. When I rode the ride in 2005, we raised I think it was about $6 million. So over the course of time, more riders, more money raised, more publicity. Over the number of years, it was multi-millions of dollars that were raised to help provide testing, as you can see on the left, and cost of medical supplies, all of that on the right. And that was one of the things that made this ride so compelling for me to do. But another one was we made a difference not only for the people who were on the ride, but for people in towns through which we rode. And I just use one example here. There is this little town of Bradley, California, and it's down, I think this was on the fourth or fifth day. I can't remember exactly which, but the ride goes through there every year. A population of 85 in this teeny little town. And we always stop and have lunch at the Bradley School, enrollment 39. But the whole town shows up. Everybody shows up. Everybody's connected with the school to make lunch for us. And the first year that I went in 2005, it was all burgers. And they've expanded the menu. And so now it's burgers and it's tacos and all sorts of things. But the kids are there serving, their parents, townspeople, they're all there. And you can imagine in a town the size of Bradley that the financial resources for a school are not great. And you can also imagine that the number of folks who are exposed, that's maybe not the best word for it, but who see a group of folks like all of these riders coming through, that's not the kind of group that they normally see. And so there's a lot of use the word evangelism. That's not quite the right way, but it's presence evangelism, just being there with 1,400 people who are focused on a cause. You know, the town of Bradley probably never sees 1,400 people rolling through it in a year, let alone on one day. And so this is just a really wonderful thing to be able to have the conversation with them. And so there's this great sense of community and exposure and education, all of this drawn together. But it's also really important because there are so many different folks that ride the ride. The number of people who've been affected by HIV/AIDS, the variety, their parents, children, loved ones, you know, spouses, partners, people that they knew at work, that do this ride and are committed to raising money for this ride. And then there are others like me who, yeah, I lost some friends in the 80s from AIDS, but that was as close as I got. They wasn't as connected as family members or things like that. But and for some of these folks, this is the only place where they can really truly be themselves and know that they will be accepted. People coming from other countries or other societies where being out as a gay person or lesbian person you just can't do that. And so here they could be who they wanted to be, and it was a week of freedom that they were able to experience. And those of us on the ride, we talk about it as the love bubble of what's going on. So, and I noticed that my camera has frozen, so I'm going to see if I can get this back to a different video here. Let's see. Well, that wasn't where I expected to go. We'll get there soon. This is where I wanted to be, but now why I can't get to my camera. Oh, come on. Stop video. Start video. There we go. Now I'm back. All right. I've had more problems with Zoom today than I can imagine. Um, anyway, so it was great, and it was a lot of fun. Um, there was ecstasy to this as well as agony, and so a lot of the ecstasy was the the roadies. These are the people who fed us, who made sure that we were taken care of along the route, schlepped our luggage from place to place, and they wanted to do as much as they could to make it fun for us. And so they would staff the rest stops, and each rest stop, we usually had 4 or 5 over the course of the day. Each one had its own crew who would set up and feed us and entertain us. And so rest stop 4 was always kind of the most fun. That was the one up there in the upper left-hand corner with the pigs. Um, I knew that there was going to be a Barbie rest stop. It wasn't number 4, but yeah, there was Barbie, so I got a chance to jump into the Barbie thing. Um, but as you can see in the upper sort of center photo, this is a big deal. They had to deal with water and food and medical and all of that kind of stuff. These are the roadies that they made the ride. And then the folks down in the bottom right-hand corner, these are folks that are taking our luggage and picking it up from us, hauling it into the vans and driving it from where we camped to the next campsite and then unloading it again up before we were ready to go, cheerful, happy, helpful. I ran out of, I already, I shoved my stuff into the truck and then went to ride and then realized I needed money to buy food at Bradley. And I'd already packed all of my money. And so one of the roadies gave me 20 bucks so that I could buy food at Bradley. And when I got back that night, I got my 20 bucks out of my cash, gave it back to him. So they were there to solve all sorts of problems. It was just a blast. Um, and then, there's the stuff on the road. This picture and what's following was kind of on the last day. There was just a lot of fun going on. But back.
Oh,
It was just a hoot. And so like I say, there was just
is that Santa Monica?
it was close.
Mhm.
I think that was between Ventura and the end. I can't remember exactly where. I'd have to look at the map of the rest stops. That may have been the last rest stop or the second to the last rest stop before we rode in. But everybody was pretty happy um, to be rolling into the end. And there were wonderful sights along the way. I mean, you're riding down the California coast, Pigeon Point lighthouse there on the left. That's the tallest lighthouse on the West Coast. We rode through the strawberry fields of the Salinas Valley, made so famous by Steinbeck. The picture of me in front of the armored vehicle down in the lower left, that was at Camp Roberts in Central California. It's now the headquarters of the main location for the California National Guard, but it was also where my dad went through basic training
Mm.
before he went off to Europe in World War II. So it was fun to be able to go through there. When I did this ride in 2005, we couldn't go into the camp. This time they let us go through it. And then, of course, you're riding along the coast, and the scenery is spectacular, as long as you could see it, given the fog and stuff like that. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then on the right, so it was just wonderful. And speaking of fun, there was what's known as Red Dress Day. Um, Way back when the ride began 30 years ago, everybody was encouraged to dress in red because the route sort of looped back on itself. And from the air, or even from far away, if you looked at all the red dressed cyclists around the route, it looked like a big AIDS ribbon. And so they wanted people to dress in red. Given the clientele of the ride, that turned into Red Dress Day, which became its own thing. And as you can see, there was a lot of dressing in red. Some people dressed more fully than others, and the people who are the most scantily dressed, they were emulating Baywatch, and so it was a hoot. And music going on, always music at the rest stops. And you can see how different all of the red dresses were. Uh, it was like I say, it was quite a hoot. And I love this guy just because I couldn't imagine how he could ride a bike in those heels or those platform shoes. And he wore them and he rode. I saw him riding his bike in those, and he had cut out something in that front portion of the shoes so that he could put in a bicycle cleat that would click into his pedals, and he did it. Red Dress Day is only about 40 miles, so it's the shortest day of the ride. So he didn't have to push through too much, but it was quite a hoot. Yeah. And then this was me at the start of the day, and me at the end of the day. I was not quite as exotic, shall we say, as many of the other riders. But I had to dress red just because I had to dress red. So this was all sort of the ecstasy of the ride. But then there was the agony, of course, and everything from rain and mist on the first day. I was stopping all the time to clear off my glasses so that I could see, um, to make sure that I wasn't riding on stuff that was dangerous. Um, there was the June gloom. If anybody's been on the West Coast in June, you know that the marine layer is just foggy until late morning, early afternoon. And so we had the June gloom even over Morro Rock and Morro Bay, fog, um, especially as we were up at the top of some of the coastal ranges. It got pretty serious and really slowed us down. And then there was time when it was just really sunny and really hot, and we needed to make sure that we were well hydrated and that we had plenty of sunscreen on. Um, and so and sometimes it was just really, really, really hot and miserable riding on bumpy roads in the heat, and just kind of tough. And then there was the medical tent. And the medical tent was again part of the agony of it. And one of the things that I learned, it's all a learning experience, um, is that going to the medical tent is an exercise in humility. Um, when I rode the ride in 2005, I went to the medical tent because I had pain in my trapezius muscles and in my Achilles tendons from tension or whatever kinds of things. This time around, I was well trained for those, but all the training in the world didn't prepare my body for where my body met the bicycle seat. And um, what they told me in the medical tent was, well, maybe you should have your seat adjusted. Well, I couldn't do that until I was done. But yeah, it was a lesson in humility in that portion of the medical tent where they had to make sure that I could make it from point A to point B for those last 4 days. And I'm very grateful for what they did, because they made it possible for me to finish. And I did ride through the finish line, able to throw my hand in the air. Um, Susan is there on the right of the screen with the arrow pointing at her head. We hadn't
yeah.
communicated well, and so she didn't know what jersey I was wearing. I'd told her that I was about ready to come down the hill, so she was watching for me. but didn't recognize the jersey because she'd never seen it before. And so she was there watching me, but she didn't realize that it was me going through. And we finally connected at the end, but it was I was glad she was there. She flew in, and then we went for a week of vacation after got off the bike and spent time in LA and then in the San Francisco Bay Area. But over the course of the ride, this first week of the ride, I personally raised $6,400, and grateful for everybody who donated. Um, Rode almost 531 miles. They advertised 540, and sometimes the route changed a little bit. Sometimes there were detours that shortened it or lengthened it. So this time my bicycle computer said 530 and a half. The computer said that I was on the bike riding for almost 45 hours. And I total elevation gain about 24,000 feet. So over 7 days, that's elevation gain of 3,300 feet a day. And that's just all of the up and down. And there my slide is frozen again. I'm gonna have to do
Yeah.
something about this, make it work better. So yeah, it was up and down, lots
We
of
are.
different stuff. So anyway, that was week one. And so now we're gonna get into kind of the meat of it. But Sandy, you're the one person who may help remember questions from Sunday morning. If you want to ask, you remember anything or anything new you want to ask at this point?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It was fun to see it again.
Yeah, well, I can say now that it's Wednesday after the election day, I've spent a whole lot of time walking through a lot of the slides from this next chunk of the that we'll be talking about and where I was and all of that. And so healing to be back in those natural spaces,
Mm,
the
so
photos,
neat.
things like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I spent 7.5 weeks. Well, actually, I spent much longer than that, but physically riding around 7.5 weeks, thinking about what being a steward means, a steward of creation. And I've got it on this slide. What is a steward of the land? But it's more than just the land, and that's where we'll go over the next several weeks. But is it wetlands that are going away, and what do we have to do with the wetlands, or is it what do we do with forest fires? Are we the cause? Are we the remedies? What does it do? What do we have to do with forest fires? So there's two examples of what I really worked on over the course of 7.5 weeks on the road, and it was like I say, 7.5 weeks. I drove 8,400 miles. I listened to about 200 hours of books and podcasts, all having to do with this question of what does a steward mean. And I came at this really from a very sort of theological, biblical question, stemming from the stuff that we learn or we hear from Genesis. Then God said, "Let us make humankind and let them have dominion." God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over." What does dominion mean? Does that mean that we can use it for whatever we want to use it for, or does it mean something else? And different translations do something else with the word dominion and be stewards. And what does steward mean? And that was the question that really gripped me. But it wasn't just that by itself. It was also a realization that I had over the course of a number of months, reading the Song of Creation, or the Benedicite, which is one of the canticles in morning prayer. But also, this is a good example from Psalm 148. Praise the Lord, sun and moon. Sing praises, all you shining stars. Praise the Lord, heaven of heavens. Sing praises, you waters above the heavens. Praise the Lord from the earth, you sea monsters and all deeps, mountains and all hills, the trees and all cedars, wild beasts and all cattle, creeping things and winged birds. Let them praise the name of the Lord. And all of this is sort of in the imperative voice. All of these entities, whether it's the sun or it's cattle or it's mountains, are implored, impelled, told to praise God. And how do they do that? And so that was the question that I started with, is how does a little flower, or how does a marmot, or how does a hillside praise God? What is it that they do? And is it just a little flower being beautiful and saying, I'm beautiful and there's my praise? Or is it something else? And that was what I really went off to look at. And so that took me to 15 national parks over 7.5 weeks. And there are only, 7 of them here, only half of them are shown. I couldn't get all 15 on the slide without making sure that you couldn't see them all. And there was a long road trip that took me from Colorado down into Arizona and Utah to California, up through Oregon and Washington, and then into Montana and Wyoming and back home, through all of these treasures of the United States. And as I said, I drove a lot. I went through all these parks and I listened to a lot of books that accompanied me while I was driving. And they raised a lot of questions and shifted my thinking about what it means to be a steward, especially of the land. And that's what I want to spend the next several minutes talking about.
You're
Is
frozen again.
Oh, thanks for letting me know. Maybe I should change I'm going to move the camera elsewhere if I can. Choose. I can't see anymore where I can shift my camera. I've
I can
lost.
see you're moving now.
Oh, wait a minute. Now I see where I can do it. There we go. Oh,
Oops.
well, that didn't work. Uh, frustrating, frustrating. Now, I'll just have to go back up here and I'm going to move this down where I can see better and I'll be able to pay more attention. Ah, there we go. Okay, so what I want to talk about is who stewards the land? That's the question. Um, and under or with what ideas, what imperatives do we steward the land? And so in a very strange, maybe way, I want to start with how this land came to us. And we go back to the beginning of American history, and we were all colonies. The Americas were colonies, and the colonies were royal for the most part, and in Europe, the lands, if they were stewarded at all, were stewarded to for the benefit of the of the royalty, of the king, of the queen, or whoever. And so, if land wasn't privately held, it was held for the king or the queen. Well, then we had this little thing called the Revolutionary War, and all of that land that had been held by King George or any of the other royalty became the land of the United States of America. And not all of that wilderness land was privately held. And then we gained more and more land as history went on, and the Louisiana Purchase and the Oregon Territory and stuff from Mexico and all of that. Who governs, who controls, who manages that vast amount of land that's out there that now has become part of the United States of America? And there weren't any good examples for how to do this. We just didn't know. There was no good example for how to govern a country that wasn't being governed on religious rules or royal rules. So I mean, we were an experiment. The United States of America was an experiment. And so, land would be given to people who went out and staked a claim. In Oklahoma, there were the famous land rushes where everybody would start and run and ride or whatever and say, this is my land. And then they would be given their 40 acres. Um, and then there was a lot of land in the middle, like where we are in Colorado, that people thought nobody is ever going to want all this kind of stuff. It's a big, vast American desert. Um, and then there's all of the land along the West Coast. Was it British originally, or was it Mexican or Spanish originally? How do you control all of this land? And especially the land that nobody is living on. And so into this question came a couple of guys, John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. And I want to talk about them because they really, in my reading and listening to books and all of that, they really came to form a lot of how I thought about this and will lead into what we'll talk about in the next couple of sessions. John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. So John Muir was born in Scotland, as you see there in 1838, and moved to Wisconsin, to Hickory Hill Farm in Wisconsin in close around 1850. And he stayed there and grew up there and worked on the farm. His dad was a Calvinist minister, a really hard taskmaster, and instilled in John both a love of Scripture, but also this need to be busy and working and all of that kind of stuff. And so whenever John didn't have to be working, he ran into the woods, and he loved exploring the woods and all of that stuff around the farm. And that became his passion. He just loved it. Hunting, fishing, exploring, hiking, playing, all of that kind of thing. Well, he, as we all do, he grew up, and he was a very, very smart guy and became an inventor. While he was doing other stuff, he invented a wooden clock and created various versions of this clock. This particular one was his desk, and it would move around. It would keep him from working on the same thing all the time. And I mean, it was just an amazing piece of inventiveness. He went to the state fair and was applauded for his inventive ability. He turned the wooden clock into something that would get him out of bed. The clock would hit a certain point and the bed would throw him out. I mean, this is just amazing kind of stuff. And all of this is, built out of wood in the 1860s and 1870s. An amazing guy. He went to school for a short while at the University of Wisconsin, and had a good experience there. He then this was about the time of the Civil War. He was a pacifist. He didn't want to be drafted, so he left Wisconsin and sort of went on walkabout, which included some time in Canada. I mean, he just became an inveterate traveler, and he found his way to California in the late 1860s. And that was where he spent basically the rest of his life living, was in California. And started writing while he was there. His writings tell a lot about what he was doing. He even though he never finished his undergraduate degree, he became a world expert in the issue of glaciers and how glaciers worked. He turned upside down the sort of universal theories that the Europeans had proposed about how glaciers work. And his theory is what it is now. I mean, he got it right. Um, and he based all of that, or most of that, on his experience in the Yosemite, what became Yosemite National Park, but in the mountains and the valleys of the Yosemite. And his time there really um, launched him into what became his life passion. But for a number of reasons, love not being the least of them, he got married in 1880 and moved to Martinez, California, which is just a little bit to the east of the San Francisco Bay. And that was his house. I was able to visit the house. And he became a rancher and a farmer there. His wife, the property was her father's, and so he sort of inherited this. But his wife knew that he really belonged in the mountains, and when he got moody, she would say, "John, it's time for you to go to the mountains," and sort of shooed him off, and he'd be gone for months, and then come back. He had several children, so I mean, he was tied. He was a good father. He was tied to this place too, but he was also tied to the mountains, and he spent a lot of time living in the mountains and around Yosemite and all of that. And it wasn't always in a house. Sometimes he was camping and in caves and all of that. His diaries are fascinating. But he saw the effect of encroachment of humans, whether it was bringing in livestock or tourists, the effects that they were having on these fabulous natural areas that he considered God's natural cathedrals. And he wanted to preserve them untrammeled. And so he was successful in convincing others to fight with him in that cause, and so was able to get some of these places established as national parks. He was the first one that he was involved with was, of course, Yosemite. That was not the first national park. Yellowstone was the first national park, but Yosemite was established in 1890, as was Sequoia, just south of Yosemite, as well as what at the time was called the General Grant National Park, which later added some land and became Kings Canyon. So Yosemite, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon were established in 1890. And I've frozen again. Um, so we're going to get going. Were established in 1890. Um, and then he traveled up and down the West Coast. He's got glaciers named for him in Alaska. He's got a mountain climbing camp named for him at Mount Rainier. So he traveled all over the place and was instrumental in getting certainly Yosemite, Sequoia, Kings Canyon, but also Mount Rainier and Crater Lake National Parks established. An amazing guy, worked really hard. He also had his hands in a couple of other national parks that I didn't visit in the desert Southwest. So an amazing guy. And in 1892, he also established the Sierra Club with some other folks. So an amazing career. Died in 1914 in LA after a long and productive life, certainly known as the father of the national parks. And we'll come back to him in a minute. The other one of these two significant figures was Gifford Pinchot. And Pinchot was very different in all sorts of ways from Muir. Pinchot was born and grew up in Connecticut from a from a wealthy family. But like Muir, he spent a lot of time in the woods. unlike Muir, he went to the best prep schools in New England. He went to Yale and uh, was he knew a lot of important people because of his family's money. And when he graduated from Yale, he was very interested in forestry, but there was no place to study forestry in the United States at that time. So he went to Europe. And of course, the forests in Europe had all been decimated as Europe had developed over the centuries. And so all of the forests in Europe were basically farmed and had been established through a forestry management program. And this is what he was introduced to in Europe in his time there, studying at the French National School of Forestry Management. Well, he studied there, and then he came back to the United States. And in 1892, he came back, and in one of his memoirs, he wrote this about his experience of coming back. When I came home in 1892, not a single acre of government, state, or private timberland was under systematic forest management anywhere on the most richly timbered of all continents. When the gray 90s began, the common word for our forests was inexhaustible. To waste timber was a virtue and not a crime. There would always be plenty of timber. The lumberman regarded forest devastation as normal and second growth as a delusion of fools. So he came back to a place where the idea that our natural resources would go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. But if you're in Connecticut and you're looking west, that's what it looks like, except that you keep cutting things down. It's not going to look like that for very long. Well, he puttered around in sort of semi-governmental stuff, and then he finally became named by George Vanderbilt as the forester for the Vanderbilt estate there at Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, that, just recently got sort of trashed by the floods in North Carolina. And so he was managing these wonderful forests around this magnificent estate. He ended up being appointed to the National Forest Commission to look at forested areas in the Western public lands. He became the chief of the Division of Forestry, the National Division of Forestry. And in 1905, the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, was established, and Pinchot was the chief. And the whole idea of managing forests was very utilitarian. We will manage them the greatest good for the greatest number of people, very utilitarian philosophy. So in 1905, for example, there were 60 units with 56 million acres of land. And in 1910, that had grown because of his influence to 150 units with 145 million acres of managed land. But again, this is managed land. And he really did a great job, Pinchot did, of sort of popularizing the idea of conserving these natural resources. And in the same book called Breaking New Ground that I took the earlier quotation from, he wrote, "Without natural resources, life itself is impossible. From birth to death, natural resources, transformed for human use, feed, clothe, shelter, and transport us. Upon them we depend for every material necessity, comfort, convenience, and protection in our lives. Without abundant resources, prosperity is out of reach. Therefore, the conservation of natural resources is the fundamental material problem." So Pinchot's concern was making sure that we manage these resources so that they're there for our use, for human use, as he put it, to feed, clothe, shelter, and transport us. That's why they're there. They're for us. So he became known as the father of American conservation, as opposed to preservation, And he ended up founding the Yale School of Forestry. Um, and then it's been renamed several times and is now environmental studies or something like that. But he was the founder of that school, partly based on his experience being there. I'm going to stop for a second and wet my whistle. Any thoughts or questions, Sandy?
This it's helpful to hear this again and I know you're leading toward some distinctions here in ways of approaching all of this. That's helpful to hear the stories of Muir um,
Pinchot.
and Pinchot,
Yeah.
and to really understand the distinction that you're making between the two of them.
Yeah. And, so, and I said this the other day, and is that they were, they were, the book that I read while I was doing this was called Natural Rivals. And we think of rivals as opponents in many ways. The book made the point that they were not necessarily opponents, but like star players on different basketball teams where they didn't necessarily dislike each other or were fighting against each other, but they were on different teams, both trying to win, and they learned from each other in so many different ways. And I just think that that's such a great way to think about, somebody that's not you, to learn from them and to be pushed towards excellence because of them. So the ultimate results of their interaction um, were the establishment of there as in 1905 the U.S. Forest Service, and then in 1916 the National Park Service, the Forest Service being related to Pinchot and the National Park Service related to
Sure.
Muir. And one of the things about the National Park Service, and I didn't say this on Sunday, and so if anybody's watching this, you're getting something you special, is that one of the questions about the National Park Service is who's going to administer it? Who are going to be the rangers? Who's going to take care of all of this stuff? Who's going to keep the poachers out? And a huge amount of controversy. Well, should the military do this? Who's going to manage these parks? And if you go to Yellowstone right now, you can see the barracks for the military that was there to keep the poachers out of the parks. So who else was going to do that? And then he said, no, we should have a service and we should have rangers and they should be professionalized. Pinchot argued for professional foresters as well. And so all of this had to do with professionalization of who was going to steward these public lands and how are they going to do it. So in terms of the national forests, and I camped at La Wiswis, that was outside of Mount Rainier, and camped in this campground, and it was very rainy, and I wasn't confident of my tent's ability to keep me dry. So I set up this rather elaborate tarp system, which worked very well. And I drove through the Gallatin National Forest on my way through Montana. But one of the bywords, and so it was the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington that I stayed in, and then coming through Gallatin, and I was able to find this sign that is the sort of the watchword of the National Forest. It's the land of many uses.
Mm.
And so the mission, this is the stated mission of the National Forest Service, is sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the national forests and grasslands. Why? To meet the needs of present and future generations. And so, the reason to do all of this is to sustain things so that they're productive for coming generations. Um, and as I note there in the bottom of the slide, the U.S. Forest Service is an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is something where we're trying to do things to produce stuff for us. We're culturing, the natural world for our use. And so that's its mission. And so the land of many uses makes sense. On the other hand, the national parks mission is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the system
Mhm.
for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. There's no mention there of the economic impact. If we think about this, it's diversity and productivity to meet the needs. This is an economic argument, whereas in the national parks, it's education, inspiration, and enjoyment. There are two very different missions of these two organizations that grew out of Pinchot and Muir. They're just different visions of how to move forward. And National Park Service is an agency of the Department of Interior, not agriculture. So it's a different way of thinking about how we're going to use this land and these resources. And as I was as I was spending time in these parks and working with, talking with rangers and other things, the ranger at Kings Canyon Sequoia that I spent some time talking with pointed out that one thing is that Sequoia National Park is the first national park established to protect a plant. Yellowstone did not protect a plant. Yosemite did not protect a plant. They were there for the geological stuff, but the Sequoia National Park was there to protect the trees. And so in the National Park Service logo, you see the sequoia tree. And anywhere you go and you look at a national park ranger's belt or the band around their Stetson, you'll see the sequoia pine cone. And so all of this has been enshrined in this in the lore and heritage of the national parks. So
Preserving those.
yes, yeah, the national parks preserves exactly. So there are other agencies that are dedicated to our public lands, and one is the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, the one before the 2020 renaming of BLM. So the Bureau of Land Management, part of the National Department of Interior, so it's similar to the National Forests, the U.S. Forest Service, but slightly different. Mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. So they're still doing management of the lands to sustain what's there. And the productivity, that's the other word, I should have put that in red, the productivity. So it's not to keep going, it's to maintain what's already there, but not necessarily to fix stuff.
Not necessarily what?
Fix, as in and repair, fix or repair or restore.
Okay.
I'll talk about that more on Sunday, that part of it.
Okay.
Then there's the Bureau of Reclamation is doing kind of the same thing for water resources. But again, as in the last part of that sentence, in the interest of the American public. I have no argument with these missions. I'm just laying them out there, and I want to come back to them in a second to raise a different question. And then, of course, there's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that manages our national wildlife refuges, where I've spent some time in the summer as well. So it's working with others to conserve, protect, enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. So, here the the mission is again focused on doing this for the American people. And I don't have any argument with that. These are agencies of the US government. They should be doing this for the people. I mean, we are the government of the people, for the people, by the people. And so our agencies should do this on our behalf. But going back to the beginning, when I talked about the quotations from the book of Genesis and that quotation from Psalms, is where does our responsibility as stewards of God's creation, where does that come into this picture? So the US government stewards all of these things, but what do we as Christians or people of faith, what do we do as God's stewards of the land? And that became a very different, what I learned from how the government stewards and where that brought us, that threw nuances to this question that I didn't have before I left. To see how Muir saw the Sierras and Mount Rainier and all of that as things to be preserved for our benefit spiritually, inspirationally, but also because we should preserve these things just because they're there, just because they're there. And Muir was a very spiritual person. He didn't necessarily put it in quite these words. Words that I would say is that God gave us the charge to steward these on God's behalf to make sure that they could do what God put them there to do. And I don't think God put all of this stuff there to exist just for our benefit, but that the mountains and the cedars and the wild beasts were there praising God by their being. And if we mess that up, then we have kind of failed in our tasks as stewards, or we have to reevaluate our tasks as stewards. And I think that that was the big learning, one of the big learnings that I had doing all of this trip and listening to a lot of these books is what's our task as stewards, God's stewards, not as the stewards of the land for the American people, but the stewards of the land in God's interest. And I think that those are two different questions, complementary, of course, but we just bring different concerns to the table. So that's what I'm going to explore over the next 2 weeks. Is what have we learned from the land? What do we see on the lands? What more do we learn? And therefore, what do we do with what we've learned, what we've been given in what world, what creation we've been placed. So that was an hour.
I see it's right up there.
Condensing a lot
That
into an hour. So
thank you. That is clearer to me after having listened to you just now. Yeah.
So what became clearer? What did you gain from that? This will be helpful for me going forward.
Well, it's that last part. It felt like you were clearer today, or at least I got it more clearly about what the distinction is you're making, that you came to ponder as a result of this experience, and that on God's behalf, I think was the clue that sort of okay, now I think I'm getting what you're talking about.
Well, one of the realizations, and I may have had this before I went on the trip, but was that if we say, and certainly the American agencies say this, but the Native Americans say this too. You know, if our concern is to preserve or conserve all of this for future generations, then that puts it in our hands. We're doing this for our benefit, even if it's our benefit 4 generations down the road.
Mhm.
And but the flip side of that is it's in our hands to do with it whatever we want. And so the decision is, do we use it up because it benefits us immediately, or do we save it for something else? Both of those put God out of the picture.
Yeah.
So they don't have to do with the fact that God established this creation. We didn't do it. Yes, we inherited it or whatever, but so do we care for it because God gave it to us to care for it for God's benefit, or is it ours to use as we will, and our altruism says that we're going to use it for our grandchildren?
Mhm.
And that's the distinction. I don't think anybody else, or very few people, are going to say, "Oh, well, yeah, that changes the whole picture." But to me, it makes a big difference. You
Mm.
know, and especially for folks who don't have children, or whose children could say, couldn't care anything about the woods. Well, why am I preserving it for you if you don't care?
Mm.
I mean, it's a subset of our own sort of internal um, self-centeredness, or our anthropomorphism, or
Mm.
anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'll come back to that in a couple of weeks in a different context, but um, that's what I've gotten about this, is that my
Oh, that's
responsibility
neat. That's neat. Yeah.
my responsibility is greater than to my children, but if I do my job well, they will benefit.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a Venn diagram about how all of this works. So,
Yeah. That's very interesting. Yes.
so.
Go, go, go for it.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you. I'm glad that you came back, Sandy, because it made it easier to talk to somebody, but also your questions were good. And I hope um, that doing this a second time, I was able to at least address some of the questions that people raised
Yeah.
during the course of the
Oh,
original conversations.
well, somebody raised about Native Americans, and I wonder whether Native American understanding would come closer to what you've just discovered here on God's behalf.
Well,
Is-
yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yes and no. Um, I went to the Ute Museum in Montrose. I went to the Navajo Museum in Tuba City. I went to the Yakima Museum in southeastern Washington State, and there's a lot of connection of humans to the natural world, and the idea that we have to preserve all of these. But in some of those places, and I can't remember exactly which ones right offhand, it was still for us and our future generations.
oh,
So there was the sense that we're intertwined, and as something that is intertwined, we have to make sure that everything moves on so that the
yeah,
world continues. So there's that sense of future generation. In some places, it was very clear. We're planting a tree not because it's going to benefit us, but because in 100 years our children will be cool under that tree. That sort of story. So yes and no, yes and no. But they're
the,
closer.
the Native Americans' attitudes about the bisons, the buffaloes. I mean, it just was so very different from, of course, the white people were coming out and killing them all. But there was a real spiritual dimension to their understanding of the bison. And yes, the bison was for they killed the bison and used the bison for building
Right,
teepees and eating. But there was something very spiritual about that
right,
relation.
right. And Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, I don't know if you read that.
I
Um,
haven't. Yeah.
most of what she's talking about is Algonquin, Haudenosaunee, or whatever it is. It's all sort of northeastern native traditions, and that's fine. Um,
Uh-huh.
but she also talks about maybe the people of the bison, but in terms of my own upbringing, the people of the salmon. And so if you go to the
Oh, yeah.
Northwest, the Pacific Northwest, the salmon hold that same pride of place that for the plains natives, the bison held.
Yeah.
And so there is that tie to the land and to the creatures that are there, the non-human animals that are there, that's similar across all of that. But as I'll talk about a little bit down the line, this we've lost this, and the native people have held it, and we Christians, or we heirs of the Bible, we look at history, even global history, through the lens of the Bible. And I'll bring this up somewhere down the line again, is that when Crater Lake, which was a volcano, when Crater Lake blew 7,700 years ago, the Klamath Indians were there and they saw it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 7,700 years ago. Biblical records, the biblical history only goes back 4,000 years. We're talking about 3,000 years before that, and they've remembered the story and they've told the story. And, so we're focused on one story that's 3,000 years younger than this other story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it raises the question of whose stories do we listen to and where do we place that value? That
Yes.
was a huge aha moment for me when I was at Crater Lake.
Oh, neat. Oh, neat. Okay.
So yeah, the question of privileging of stories, huge question. And what do we do with that? So anyway.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandy, and I'll see you soon. But I'm going to shut this down so I can get the recording turned into a YouTube video so that other people can look at me frozen on the screen.
Which you keep doing.
Anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Uh,
Okay.
good night.
Bye. Okay.